Shabbat Shalom. According to the Midrash, when little children first begin their Jewish religious studies, they are introduced to the opening page of the third book of the Torah, Vayikra, Leviticus. A little honey is placed on the page, and each child is invited to taste the sweetness of Torah. When the Midrash asks itself why the book of Leviticus in particular, the Midrash answers itself by saying, "Let pure children find sweetness in the laws of purity." Lovely. Okay. While trying to impose his own scholarly sense of order on Jewish law, Maimonides came up with a precise list of the Taryag mitzvot, the 613 commandments. Of the 613, how many deal with sacrifices? 100. Right, 100. Plus another 50 directly connected with priestly activities. That makes 100 plus 3. 150 out of 613 that deal with sacrifices. We know that the 5 books of Moses have different names in Hebrew. The Torah itself is called Torat Moshe, Moses' Torah. Genesis was sometimes called Maaseh Breshit, the story of creation. Exodus obviously was called Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. Numbers was called Pikudim because of the census that was repeated in there. And Deuteronomy was called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah. So what about Leviticus, Vayikra? It was called, no surprise, Torat Kohanim, the laws, the Torah of the priests. And the Greek name Leviticus carries its own obvious link to the Levites and to sacrifice. Rabbi Joseph Caro asserted that the study of Leviticus is as acceptable to God as the actual sacrifices in the temple once were. The Chofetz Chaim thought that studying parts of Leviticus is a necessary prelude to the coming of the Messiah. Think about that. And by the way, Maimonides lamented the fact that by the 12th century, very few Jews were studying Leviticus, so that in this case, both the learned and the ignorant possessed equal knowledge. Maimonides wasn't happy. One of the motivations behind the now widely celebrated Daf Yomi project was to get people to open up the book of Leviticus again, if only to get to the sublime chapter 19 and its guidelines to imitating God as an act of holiness. Our Sedra is the opening chapters of the book of Leviticus, Leviticus 1:1 and following. No narrative. Rabbinic scholars and those of us who have had to offer sermons during the weeks when chapters of Leviticus are read, what is the Haftorah that week? Let's talk about that. Have sought to conceptualize Leviticus, to spiritualize Leviticus, and sometimes to literally ignore much of Leviticus. Parents who are tasked with working with their soon-to-be B'nai Mitzvah children to develop a Devar Torah out of the sacrificial material sometimes express some rather serious anxiety tinged with a bit of anger. Many moderns push back against Leviticus, finding very little that is salutary in all of those passages dealing with sacrifice, physical purity, animals. Some use toxic words like primitive, relic of the past, and even abhorrent. But there are increasing numbers of contemporary scholars who are able to push aside an almost habitual rejection of Leviticus and have begun mining its significant teachings, its meaningful insights for our day. Rabbi Dr. Devorah Weisberg speaks of the human need to express gratitude. and to connect with mechanisms that can help us move past our guilt. Leviticus makes clear that there are the correct ways, the correct animals, the correct place, the correct time. She reminds us that one of the greatest challenges to any monotheistic religion is to bridge the gap between a transcendent God and this physical world, and that sacrifice served a great purpose in closing that gap. Rabbi Weisberg celebrates how important it is for people to have concrete ways to express their deepest yearnings. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg does conclude that, quote, the somewhat remote and iffy sacrificial system, close quote, thanks Yitz, can turn some people away. But he also returns to the human needs that this system sought to address, to remove the impact of sinful behavior for both the individual and the community. Intentional or unintentional sins can become like an infectious disease. Yitz's words. God cannot dwell in our midst if we have not found a way toward repentance and forgiveness. And for Yitz, that goal is much of what Leviticus is all about. So I turn to a masterful, probably genius-level book by anthropologist Mary Douglas, a book entitled Leviticus as Literature. This book right here. This 1999 book is designed for those who want to learn how to read Leviticus with eyes that are not only freshly opened, but with a grudging humility about all that we might have missed in our previous studies of this third book of the Torah. Douglas begins by rejecting the widespread notion that the forbidden animals in Leviticus are unpleasant animals. Rather, their classification as forbidden was just a necessary part of the biblical system to find certain things, certain people, certain acts, certain clothing, certain behaviors as being either acceptable or unacceptable. Leviticus asserts that there is a social order to creation, and learning that principle, social order to creation, is far more important than spending years in trying to figure out why one act or one animal was put in one column and another act, another animal put in a second column. Douglas reads Leviticus as celebrating rituals that are intentionally embedded with social values. I'm going to repeat that. Douglas reads Leviticus as celebrating rituals that are intentionally embedded with social values and thus crucial to the building of a modern religion. In many ways, Leviticus actually served to successfully separate early Judaism from the other religions in the region. Leviticus purged Judaism of most of the central features of those other ancient religions. In their place, Leviticus set the justice of God and the covenant that define the relationship between God and God's people. There is so much more, so much astonishing richness and lucid commentary in this book. Douglas wrote this, quote, Leviticus reveals itself as a theological treatise in the full sense of the word and fully in the biblical tradition. It offers a systematic theory of divine justice which underlies Genesis and Exodus, close quote. I close with an image drawn from the writings of Yeshayahu Leibowitz. God's voice is overwhelmingly powerful. That thundering voice once terrified the Israelites as they stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. So God continued speaking just with Moses throughout the wandering, and did so from within the tabernacle. But the people standing outside of that tabernacle could hear nothing of that thundering voice. The voice of God simply could not be heard by anyone standing outside of the Mishkan. The point is that those who are involved in the service of God can also hear God's voice. God's voice invites within the tabernacle of study all who would seek to embrace the life of Torah, metaphorically, poetically. Leibowitz asks each of us to enter that tabernacle, to choose to continue to study the Book of Leviticus and the Torah in all of its manifestations, to continue to discover powerful new lessons from texts that we have too casually discarded. Shabbat Shalom, my friends. Have a great week, and maybe we can actually meet someday within the Mishkan, listening to God's voice explaining the richness of Leviticus.